Go. So again, thank you and welcome everyone to the course, The Buddhist Path of Awakening. We are making our way through the profound treasury of the ocean of Dharma, and we are on volume 2. These volumes contain digested talks from either 13 or 15 years of seminary that Trungpa Rinpoche taught in the course of his lifetime here in America. And these 15 years were digested into these 3 volumes. We're on volume 2 on the Mahayana, chapter 19, which is entitled Discovering a World Beyond Ego. And we are entering into the world of the Bodhisattva, Shinyata, emptiness. And Michael is going to lead off today.
So, welcome everyone, and as John said, we are well into the profound treasury at this point. This entire section of the book, all of these chapters we're reading now are titled Emptiness and Compassion. And just to give a quick definition of emptiness, quick and dirty, one of the things that's become clear to me in studying the Mahayana is that a bodhisattva does not see the world in the way that most people do. And one aspect of that seeing the world differently is summed up in the term emptiness or Shinyata. Shinyata refers to the lack of a real fixed identity or nature to things, including ourselves. And so in this chapter, Discovering a World Without Ego, ego is doing exactly that, projecting some kind of real, fixed, permanent identity, either onto ourselves or the world around us, things in the world around us. And with this projection of ego into the world around us and onto ourselves, it becomes a tremendous obstacle to compassion. I think this is most clear when we really experience a sense of solidified twofold ego in a moment of aggression, whether it's somebody cutting in front of us in traffic or somebody at work not following through or whatever it is. Develop a very definite sense of ourself, a very definite sense of this other person, and a very definite sense of the relationship between. And all of that is twofold ego, which can lead to aggression, can lead to other klesha activity as well, but becomes a tremendous barrier to compassion. So I don't want to get, hopefully I won't get too conceptual about this. It's pretty clear to me in my study of Buddhism that the problems with conceptual mind, for all the wonderful things that conceptual mind can do, that there are 2 major problems with conceptual mind that can really get in the way of our understanding something like shunyata or emptiness. One is that the conceptual mind tends to mistake the concept for the actual experience. So, and this is pretty ordinary. I could say a word like awake or aware, and you would know what I mean. But that's very different from the actual experience of awareness that we might have in meditation when we're actually able to settle. So that one of the problems with conceptual mind is a tendency to confuse the concept for reality or confuse the concept for experience. And the other thing, this comes out of Buddhist philosophy, is that the conceptual mind tends to work by exclusion, tends to define categories by what things are not. So a cat is everything is, anything that's not a cat is a cat. Oh, I say that backwards, I think. I might be confusing myself here. But the point is that it becomes tricky with emptiness, because emptiness or shunyata does not mean that there's nothing there. It just means that it doesn't exist in the way that we think it does. And that's why in teachings you'll hear such terms as appearance emptiness. The things appear in a certain way, but they lack any kind of solid, definite, fixed identity. So Shinyata is this lack of real existence or identity or ego, is how things actually are. And we can get confused by this because we tend to project a reality onto things that's not really there. And then have to conceptually work our way back to realizing that, oh, that's a projection. So that it might seem that we create Shinyata, but in fact, Shinyata is the actual nature of things to begin with. So it's a misperception to think that we have to make things into Shinyata. Rather, that's how things already are. And in the same way, it's not that we have to make ourselves egoless. We already are egoless. We just don't recognize that, or we're confused and caught up in ignorance and all of the chaos and of the kleshas and so on. And so we solidify an identity that isn't really true, isn't really there. And that's what I mean by saying that Bodhisattva, a fully realized Bodhisattva, does not see the world in the way that most people do. So the first section of chapter 19, Discovering a World Without Ego, is the developing egoless, the Hinayana foundation. And Trungpa Rinpoche begins by saying, the Mahayana, like the Hinayana, is based on the development of egolessness. In general, the various levels of the path have to do with your relationship to ego and your understanding of egolessness. The Mahayana realization of twofold egolessness is dependent on the Hinayana, in which you first need to develop egolessness of individuality, or sometimes he calls it egolessness of self, egolessness of individuality, as well as the first half of egolessness of dharmas. So as one teacher I heard once said, in fact, what Buddhism teaches is really simple. What's complicated is all the confusion we bring. And this is perhaps, I think, a good example of that because again, our true nature is egoless, but what we layer over on top of that becomes incredibly complicated and leads us to become confused as to the nature of reality. So in the Hinayana, individual salvation, Trungpa Rinpoche says, means working with yourself. It's based on renunciation and in turn renouncing the renunciation itself. So there's a constant process of letting go. In Myth of Freedom, Trungpa Rinpoche talks about the spiritual path as like peeling an onion, and that there's layer after layer after layer. And that's what we're working with here. As he said, that the various levels of the path have to do with your relationship to ego and your understanding of egolessness. So I think one thing I think is helpful here is to actually go back and look at some material that we've already read. And in particular, I want to reference chapter 8 in this book, the chapter titled Overcoming Ego Fixation. Because there, Trungpa Rinpoche says, if you follow the sequence of the 5 skandhas and the 12 nidanas, it becomes crystal clear that the world is not made by someone else, but is of your making. In the Hinayana, you dissect your ego and divide it into its components. You divide the ego into 5 skandhas and study the case history of ego in the form of the 12 nidanas. But he goes on to say also that simply learning about the 5 skandhas does not particularly help. You have to work on each individual skandha step by step. And this is what I was trying to say before, that simply having a concept of the skandhas is not enough, that we actually have to look at our own experience and see how the skandhas manifest in our own experience, so that when we're able to settle in meditation practice and slow down so that we can actually look at what our actual experience is, then we see that who we are changes from moment to moment. And the more we reflect on that, if we reflect in particular on the course of our lives, we see that this is happening all the time, that there isn't a sense of self that's permanent or fixed, that one moment we're thinking, even in meditation practice, I'm settling into awareness, and I want to just rest in awareness. Moments later, we're thinking about something else, maybe bills we have to pay or what we need to do at work. It doesn't matter, whatever it is, but that our motivation, our feelings, our perceptions are changing constantly from moment to moment. And as we look at the five skandhas in terms of what we consider form to begin with, it was what we basically say I. 1 minute I could be I am meditating. The next minute I is my aching back, and I'm thinking about what can I do about my back. And it just goes on and on like that. As I say, it can be incredibly complicated. But the point is to actually look at the skandhas and look at our experience in the skandhas: form, feeling, perception, concept, and consciousness, and see that there's a constant flux, constant change, constant impermanence, and that there isn't a fixed self, there isn't a fixed identity, that in fact, who we are, what we're doing, how we're feeling, what we perceive is changing, let alone the change that you would see, or I would see if I look back 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. I could keep on going, but that's enough. That the person that I was then, what I thought I was doing then, how I felt about things, constant change, that there is not a permanent fixed self. And we can see this by, again, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, actually looking at the skandhas and even looking at how we relate to the skandhas. In one class, I was told that there are actually 20 mistaken ways of looking for a self in the skandhas, and unfortunately they only went over 2. But one is to actually identify with the skandha. For instance, I am angry, and act on that. And the other is to actually feel that we possess the skandhas. And I talk about my anger as if it was something separate from me, and that therefore there must be something that possesses that because I see something else that's separate from that. And again, a constant flux of I and other, a constant flux of feelings, a constant flux of perceptions, and so on. So this leads to the discovery or the realization that there is no real, simple, fixed, permanent I. In other words, that there is that it's empty of any kind of real identity, any kind of fixed, permanent nature. So then Trungpa Rinpoche says, once you've accomplished that, egolessness of self, you're on the brink of ego of dharmas. You begin to question why you're doing all this, and you discover the karmic chain reactions of the 12 nidanas. And as you study the nidanas, or interdependent origination, you realize that you have to reverse that process to cut through it. So here he's partly talking about the Pratyeka Buddha approach in the Hinayana, where the classic metaphor is that the Pratyeka Buddha finds a bone in a graveyard and begins contemplating death, and then works his way back through the nidanas, all the way back to ignorance. And in that way achieves some kind of further letting go of a sense of self. As real as realizing that not only is there not a permanent self, but the self comes to be, or any particular sense of self comes to be because of a variety of causes and conditions that are always changing, that it's our sense of self is interdependent. And the way that the Buddha talked about this in one of the sutras is that because of interdependence, because of things coming together, because of many causes and conditions, what seems to be a single thing actually is because phenomena lean on each other. And the example he gave in the one sutra was like of a roof with 2 slats like this, and that if you just take away one, the whole thing collapses. Obviously, there are a lot of causes and conditions that are more complex than that, but the idea is that there isn't an inherent self, that it's a coming together and a constant flux of causes and conditions. Interestingly enough, in some Zen traditions, what Trungpa Rinpoche called emptiness, sometimes in some Zen traditions is called boundlessness because of the constant changing nature of things. In any case, going back to the ego, the one and a half fold egolessness, which is what we're about to talk about. He says, and this is again from chapter 8, the first fold is egolessness of self. Having understood that, in other words, understanding that there isn't a permanent fixed self, Having understood that, you go on to the second fold, the egolessness of external phenomena or dharmas. At this point, your understanding is only partial, so it is referred to as 1.5-fold egolessness. You have realized the egolessness of external phenomena, but not the egolessness of the perceiving itself. So there's a sense, again, that just as there's no fixed nature, no permanent identity in ourselves, there's no fixed permanent identity in others and in other things, but there's still some clinging to the perceiving of that. There's still some sense of the experience of that. Or as he says in this chapter, you've managed to work on the gross level of your experience of dharmas or things as they are, but you still perceive in terms of opinion and attitude. At a gross level, your attitude, which we'll come back to in a moment, your attitude, perceptions, and opinions about the ego of dharmas or ego of other have been cut through by your experience and understanding of the 12 nidanas, again, the interdependent nature of things. But at a subtle level, you have not reached the full understanding of where all these things come from. The source is not cut through. There's still a clinging to the perceiver. The ego of dharmas comes from fixation on the am of I am. You have liberated the I, but have still not clarified the level of am. So with this, I actually went back to the Path of Individual Liberation, the book we read in the previous course, and this is pages 531 to 534 if you want to look at it later. It's in the chapter called Cutting Through the Numbness of Ego, chapter 68, where he goes into I am quite a bit. So basically, begins by talking about the practice of Shamatha Vipassana, and says that basically through the practice of shamatha and settling the mind and letting mind's natural clarity begin to manifest, then we're capable of vipassana or clear seeing. And that with that, as he says, once you have attained a state of mind in which you can relax and actually trust something, among other things, perhaps your understanding or perception of things. Once you can relax and actually trust something, you come up with two problems, I and am. What and what? What is who I am, what I am, where I am, and what is what's going on. So there are two basic types of ego. Your existence as a full-fledged individual, and your existence as a full-fledged individual reacting to various situations. So these are the egos that we're cutting through or dissolving through practice. They are me and mine. These two situations, me and mine, are non-peace. Your experience of yourself is very hassled and confused. In other words, there's suffering attached to being attached to ego. So your experience of self is very hassled and confused. He says the ego of individual existence, or the ego of self, is like a bachelor, or to be fair, a bachelorette, who has hassles already. And the ego of dharmas, or ego of other, is like being married, which creates further hassles. So I is the individual ego, and am is the ego of reference point. I is me, and am is my existence. And am is then qualified further by someone saying you are. And he says, because the ego process is so simple, an understanding of egolessness is possible. I not, or I know, am not, or am no. Why? Because I is made out of emptiness. The point is there is nothing you can find that is an I at all. It is empty, impermanent. So this is, again, Hinayana understanding, Hinayana notion of beginning to understand, first of all, the egolessness of self, the absence of a true identity. And secondly, then, the absence of ego of dharmas, ego of other, ego of perceiver. According to Hinayana Abhidharma, dharmas are not quite real. They are as real as if you had a cup of tea in your hand, as real as what you have in your reality, but that is a temporary reality. Ultimately, nothing is real. There's nothing to hold on to, and nothing is holding on to anything. That is why egolessness is possible. You feel, I think this what it's about to say is just a description of what it would be like to perceive the world in terms of egolessness, twofold egolessness. You feel everything is surface, as waves floating back and forth continuously, but none of it is true or real. So in the Mahayana, and even more so in the Vajrayana, it's a quality of experience being somewhat illusory. Regard all dharmas as dreams. That things seem real in the moment, but in fact, there is constant change, constant flux, constant impermanence. So then coming back to the chapter that we read for today, in entering the Mahayana, you are giving up and letting go. You're letting go of your fixation on individual salvation, and you're letting go of your righteousness and religiosity. Everything is regarded as attitudes. We're back to, again, with the final half-folded ego being the perceiver, the one holding attitude. Everything is regarded as attitude, but it is not attitude that is being cut through. Attitude has been cut through already. So that's in attitude's been cut through with one and a half fold egolessness. Rather, it's the attituder or the experiencer of attitude that is cut through, which is the second half of the ego of dharmas. When the experience of mind's creation, because this is ego of self, ego of other, is all a creation of mind. When the experience of mind's creation has been cut through, you realize everything is understandable and perceivable. And by the way, I looked up attitude just to have a good definition, an interesting definition. It's a mental position in regard to a fact or state, or a feeling or emotion toward a fact or state. So that's been let go. And the perceiver of attitude, the attituder, the person who has that experience is also cut through. And he says, when you've begun to overcome the fixator, the philosopher, the conceptualizer, you begin to develop an appreciation for the absence of twofold ego. Although it is not so easy and may not have happened completely, you still feel that you've overcome something. At that point, the dawn of Mahayana, or the dawn of the absence of twofold ego, occurs in your mind. It's quite cheerful. Nothing is depressing. The vast action of the Bodhisattva begins to develop, and you experience the dawn of Mahayana as luminosity and brilliance. So he's talking about an experience of complete openness, complete freedom, and complete acceptance of the world just as it is and of the self just as it is, which we begin to practice in our meditation. In any case, that was the chapter on the titled the Developing Egolessness. So the next section, he talks about differentiating technique and experience. And here he says that development of egolessness is a progressive process, not a sudden attainment. And if you look back at chapter 8 in this book, he says something quite similar. He says it's an evolutionary process. And basically, we start with shamatha, mindfulness meditation. Shamatha is the basic technique. On the basis of shamatha, vipassana is the practice that leads to the realization of the first egolessness, which is the egolessness of self, and then to the realization of 1.5-fold egolessness, which is the egolessness of self, and the first half of the egolessness of dharmas. So again, we begin with shamatha meditation, just simply learning to be present, learning to allow ourselves to settle, taming the mind, renunciation in the Hinayana, renunciation of ego, renunciation of all the pursuits that are ego-driven, so that we do experience some peace and so that we do experience some clarity. And with that clarity, then we have the superior seeing, the clear seeing of vipassana, which allows us to begin to recognize egolessness. The Vipassana practice then culminates in prajna, discriminating awareness wisdom or wisdom, the technique that brings the complete experience of twofold egolessness of Shinyata. So first there is the tool, and then there is the experience. We should not confuse the technique with the experience, he says. He says something similar again in chapter 8, if you want to, interested in going back to read that. And if you're interested in reading more about the Vipassana experience and how it relates to emptiness, chapters 46 and 47 in the Path of Individual Liberation, titled Glimpses of Emptiness, and investigating the subtleties of experience. Both relate to Vipassana and emptiness. We did read them before, but it's interesting, I think, sometimes to go back and look at some of this material again. In any case, Vipassana practice culminates in prajna. We're developing prajna, developing wisdom. You cannot have Mahayana without Vipassana. It would be like a tree without a trunk. The whole thing is ancestral. Prajna gives birth to the Shinyata experience of the Buddhas, and Vipassana is the stone that sharpens the sword of prajna. You could not experience twofold egolessness with just Vipassana because you could not do it without prajna. But if you abandon Vipassana, you don't get anywhere at all. So that, again, we're talking about a progressive stages here of developing our intelligence, developing our clarity, developing our wisdom. Prajna is a technique as much as Vipassana or Shamatha. Shinyata is what you get, and prajna is what you're going to get it with, he says. Shinyata is like death, and prajna is like a deadly weapon. However, he's talking about death in terms of overcoming ego here. So, prajna can be regarded as a microscope, and shinyata is what's on the slide. That is why the Heart Sutra places an emphasis on prajna. Shinyata is discovered in the phrase, no eye, no ear, no nose, and so on. But prajna is actually more important. Sharpening and cleaning your instrument is more important than what you see with it. You can't cut with shinyata. Shinyata happens after the fact. Since prajna is the instrument with which you discover shinyata, shinyata is regarded as the child of prajna paramita. And I meant to get this out earlier. I wanted to just read that section of the Heart Sutra that says exactly that. Therefore, Shariputra, since the Bodhisattvas have no attainment, they abide by means of prajna paramita. Since there is no obscuration of mind, there is no fear. They transcend falsity and attain complete nirvana. All the Buddhas of the three times, by means of prajna paramita, fully awaken to unsurpassable, true, complete enlightenment. Therefore, the great mantra of prajna paramita, the mantra of great insight, the unsurpassed mantra, the unequaled mantra, the mantra that calms all suffering, should be truth, since there is no deception. So those are the first two sections, and John will take it from here.
Unmute, please.
Here we go. Let's see if this works. Did you pin yourself? Well, no. Because right now, hold on a second, everyone. Having difficulty with this recording. Okay. I'm going to go back a little bit and make sure that we understand, or at least put it into other words, the problem, as well as the solution. The problem being confusion, suffering, which is the result of confusion. And the confusion is that we believe in ego. And the two kinds of ego, the ego of self and the ego of dharmas. I want to explain what a dharma is in this case. I mean, dharma is a word that has quite a few meanings. You may be familiar with the idea of dharma as being the teachings. Another meaning is truth. Another meaning is norm. But in this discussion, it has a very particular meaning. It comes from the early Buddhist teachings called the Abhidharma, which define the world in terms of the arising and passing of discrete mental events that actually exist. And so Dharma here means true existence. And there are many, many dharmas from this point of view. There's the dharma of your computer screen. There's the dharma of the sound that you're hearing now. All of these things are things that arise and pass away in an instant, and yet they have some true existence. And this is the ego of dharmas. It really means the ego of other. There's the ego of I believe in that I exist. And when I believe that I exist, I also believe that others exist. The computer screen, the sound, the sensation of your bottom on the chair, the other person that you're talking to, whoever it may be. And so confused people go through their lives in the world in constant relationship between I and other. And that relationship is fraught. It's problematic. And there are basically three types of relationship. These are called the three poisons. When you see something as desirable, you want to pull it to you. This is the poison of desire or passion. When you see the other as dangerous to you, you want to push it away. That is aggression. And when you are indifferent, that's called ignorance or ignoring. And you just stay the same distance. This is what two things can do. They can either get closer together, further apart, or stay the same distance. And these are the three fundamental problematic relationships that can exist between I and other. So when we believe that we exist and that I am, then I am always in relationship to other. That's what the am is all about. I am a friend. I am an enemy. I am a victim. I am a beneficiary. I am whatever it may be in that relationship that we have with other. And we go through our lives, our world, in constant and ever-changing problematic relationships between I and other. This is the very core of the suffering of samsara. And it's confusion because these I and others don't actually exist. They are just fictions. They are mental creations. As Trungpa Rinpoche once said, I is no more real than the idea of spaceships in the sky, flying saucers in the sky. It's a fiction. So we're stuck in this difficult, problematic life that we feel we constantly are having to solve problems, make things better, avoid pain. And this is samsara, it's called. It's a constant churning. It never ends. One thing leads into the next. The Buddhist path is about bringing it to an end. And we start with shamatha. With shamatha, we begin to cut this karmic chain, this chain of constant back and forth. How do we do it? By focusing our minds one-pointedly on an object and coming back from mental activity. That mental activity is fraught with I and other problems. All the problems, my rent, my lover, my health, my aging, my whatever it may be. And we come back from that to awareness of something here in the present moment. In the present moment, whatever arises is real. In the past and the future, which is the domain of thought, it's all fiction. It's stories like TV dramas, like movies that we go to see in a theater. And those movies and those dramas are driven by the tension of wishing things were otherwise, of being afraid of one thing and wanting and desiring another, of the three poisons. So what we're talking about here, this whole chapter, in fact, the discussion that Trungpa Rinpoche is moving into in the Mahayana, the discussion of emptiness. What emptiness means is the twofold emptiness, the absence of the belief in I and the absence of a belief in other. And this is really stripping away the false fictions that confused sentient beings entertain about themselves and their world. And when these are stripped away, the name that's given to that experience or that understanding is Shinyata, emptiness. Empty, void of what? Empty of the false belief in a self and the false belief in others, and that relationship between the two. This is a fiction. From one point of view, many people, the whole world, is caught in this fiction. From another point of view, from the point of view of the Buddhas, we are a very small number of the infinite number of beings in the universe, and the rest of them are enlightened. So, and that we feel that we have been stuck in this for eons, since beginningless time. But again, from the Buddha's point of view, it's but a finger snap, because it's all a dream. It's a dream, it's a mental creation, and when one awakens to reality. And there isn't even a one that awakens. There is just reality, if you can even point to it. And this is what is being indicated by Shinyata. Shinyata is a word that is used, well, it's used throughout the path, but it's a dominant concept as the person, the practitioner, begins to awaken, as they begin to enter into the Bodhisattva path. Later, other terms come into play as well to describe the reality that the practitioner begins to experience. So he talks about what happens when we begin to awaken from this dream. The awakening takes place partly through study, but even more through the practice of meditation. As Michael just said, Vipassana. Vipassana is built on the foundation of mindfulness, Shamatha, which means that we're coming back from these dreams of the past and the future, of I and other, into simple awareness in the present moment. And then Vipassana means that having come back, we are now actually aware of the world, the big world, not just a one-pointed awareness, but an open panoramic awareness of this world as it arises and is continually changing and fluxing around us and in us and through us. And that by doing this, by coming back again and again into this greater awareness, the fictions of I and other begin to fade away, to dissolve, to disappear, and our perception of the world begins to change because we are beginning to see the world and ourselves stripped of these false beliefs. The belief in I and other is very heavy. It contains as well judgments of good and bad. What's good is what's good for me, and what's bad is what's bad for me in one way or another. Even when we say that what's bad is bad for others, it's because we're taking their side. So it's really bad for me, not my opinion of what's right. And those ideas of good and bad, I and other, are tremendously confusing. They are veils which literally fog our perception of the world, visual, auditory, all of it, tactile and olfactory, gustatory, all of those are fogged by the conceptual overlays of I and other, good and bad, for me, against me. This constant projection, we can get lost in our dreams. And so what it's talking about here is Shunyata is a way of coming out of these dreams and experiencing this world stripped of these falsities, of these fictions, seeing it as it truly is, stripped of I and other. And that's what Shinyata means. It means devoid of the false belief in I and the false belief in other. This is the twofold egolessness. In the entrance into the Mahayana, the middle stage of the path, which is what we're talking about in this volume that we're working on, is the discovery of Shinyata. He says here, going on to the next section, in the early stages of the path, your journey could be seen as an actual journey. You think that you are getting somewhere. That's when you begin, when you're a Hinayana practitioner. You're doing Shamatha, perhaps, and you're doing Vipassana, and you think, gee, my mind's calming down. I'm getting someplace. I'm beginning to feel calmer. I'm beginning to feel smarter. But as soon as your commitment has been made and you have begun to practice and to work on your mind, he says, your journey becomes a non-journey. Instead of a journey outward or higher or to better, your journey becomes inward and deeper. And what that means is that you, instead of trying to get better, to improve yourself, you're beginning to let that whole notion of self-improvement go and to settle in to what you already are here and now, before there was any idea, or even after there was any idea of self-improvement, of path, of making things right. All of that begins to evaporate. And so the journey becomes an inward journey, he's calling it. Call it a journey to where we already are. Because in fact, as Michael said, we already are Buddha. We already have Buddha in us. We are that fundamentally. It's just that we have lost track of it. We've gotten confused. We've gotten lost in a story, in dreams, many stories. Then he says, in the Mahayana, that deeper journey of coming present into this world, into Shinyata, takes place by means of compassion. This is beautiful. This means that it's the opening of our hearts towards the world, towards others, and towards ourselves that enables us to begin to let go of these fraught, anxious, mean, dangerous dreams and come back into awareness of this present moment now, which is continually happening, continually evolving. He says you are willing to give, willing to open and extend yourself. Because of that inward journey, that encouragement within yourself, you can afford to open out to others. And opening out doesn't mean that you're tearing off you're tearing open your shirt. What it means is you're just being here completely without agenda, without that interior monologue of what am I going to get out of this? And instead, you're right here, ready for anything, ready to engage, ready to communicate, ready to love, ready to be whatever in the moment. You do not constantly have to complain about this and that. That's a good one. Instead, you could do something, you could interact, you could have fun. And the more you are willing to open and to extend yourself to others in the world, that much deeper is your inward journey. And that much more apparent, definite, and real it becomes. And frankly, I don't feel it's so much of an inward journey. It's inward outward. It's everything. It's like our growing appreciation for this beautiful world and our ability to relax and be here in it. And the first step is you commit yourself to Mahayana ideals and principles by taking the Bodhisattva Vow. This vow fundamentally is that you're going to put others before yourself. That is so anti-ego. Ego always wants to be first. Ego doesn't give anything unless it thinks it's going to get something from it. It's going to profit by it. And this is saying, no, others first. And what it really means is loving this world and everything in it. He says, it brings you much closer to being enlightened. To do that, to give that, to make that gesture, to make that taking the Bodhisattva vow of putting others before yourself, of being generous constantly. He says you begin to find that dedicating yourself to others brings you much closer to the idea of basic sanity, enlightenment. Tathagata means the essence of the Buddhas, or whatever you might call it. Why? Because it's dissolving this fiction of ego. Putting others first dissolves this notion of I and other and the constant battle, jockeying between the two, or the three, or however many. Then he says, you're not concerned with dogma or with reference points. This is experiential. This is what happens now in your meditation practice. The Vipassana leads you into it, and it begins to become prajna. Prajna means seeing this world stripped of I and other, stripped of those false beliefs and all of the struggle which happens between them. And he says, you're dropping your case history, getting into new situations. Old preconceptions about who you are and what the world is have to be abandoned in order to rediscover yourself, letting go of the stronghold of ego. So we've got these case histories that we carry around with ourselves about, how we've suffered and how we made mistakes and how other people victimized us and how we did the bad things to them and all of this stuff. All of that is just stories. And we are beginning to shift our allegiance from these kinds of stories which spin in our heads to the perception of this world as it arises now, because that's what's real. The rest of it is dream. And then he says, you are going to discover the, quote, continual, inexhaustible, exuberant youth you possess within yourself. Such youthfulness has nothing to do with chronological age. That's good. You have possessed youthful qualities all along, but your involvement with preconceived notions of society, tradition, concepts, and ideas has made you old. So in a sense, the Bodhisattva path is a path of regaining your youth, because we're living here in the present moment. It's always young. This moment is always new, and we're living in it, we're participating in it, whatever it may be. He says that in the Mahayana, rediscovering your youthfulness is based on both inspiration and loneliness, that we're giving up the whole notion of I and other. That's the fundamental loneliness. And the inspiration is that we begin to realize that this world is beautiful. And not only is it beautiful, but we are wholesome. We are fundamentally wholesome. We think of ourselves as being so corrupted, as being so flawed. And what this path is about is rediscovering our Buddha nature, that we are fundamentally, each one of us, whole, good, sane, wholesome, worth being here for ourselves and others. He says, your old stories and autobiography keep coming back. In the Mahayana, you're not trying to forget the past. You're including it, not as a saving grace, a reference point, or a bank of quotations, but you are looking into that old hat world with the perception newly gained by jumping out into the open and becoming a bodhisattva. So what we're doing is we're understanding where we've come from, and we're understanding where we're going. And where we're going is into the freedom and the generosity and the lack of reference point of being a bodhisattva. He says, by taking the Bodhisattva vow and becoming a potential bodhisattva, you are beginning to find a new approach to that old hat world. This new old hat is called Shinyata, emptiness. It's just seeing the same world stripped of preconception. He says, the Buddha asked you to leave behind any lenses or glasses of interpretation and to come as you are, naked. You're deciding to put aside all those masks and lenses. You could simply present yourself to your teacher and to the Buddha. It might be embarrassing, but they are happy to see you as you are. And he talks about how when the Buddha taught this, there were some disciples who couldn't let go, and they had heart attacks. Shinyata pulled the rug out from under them, and their security was gone, the security of the story that one tells oneself. He finally closes with this part. He says, the Mahayana provides an immense sense of freedom. Freedom from the constant worry and fear of jockeying for one's well-being. Freedom from that the world, that one could actually let go and become a citizen of this universe, accepting everything and knowing that you're going to work with anything and everything that arises for you. It says there are three kinds of freedom: the freedom to think, react, and to practice. The freedom to think means that we are free to use our insight, prajna, our basic existence, that we are fundamentally are to work with the essence of Buddha mind, with prajna and compassion. It means that we're to wake up from these dreams, see them, come back to awareness, more and more shift our allegiance from the dream world to this real world as it arises now. There's a kind of fear that can come up with that, because in coming back into this real world, one is giving up the reference points of all the stories that we've been telling ourselves about who we are and where we're going and where we don't want to go. And giving up those reference points is kind of like giving up your identity, floating free, becoming a citizen of the universe. And the second freedom is to react, and that means that we can go along with the emotionality of the practice of compassion. One begins to become very moved by this world, by the suffering and the joy of others, as well as of oneself, and then becomes actually very sweet, emotional, joyful, full of love, and that one can go along with that. And finally, the freedom to accomplish is that basically we can take those two and put them together, seeing the world stripped of the false beliefs about I and other and the relationships that we've created between them that are all fictions, and then having compassion, having an open-hearted love for this world and for all the people and sentient beings in it. These three provide the ground to work on our understanding of emptiness, Shinyata. He's talking about how in the ordinary world, no one actually sacrifices their own interests to help other people. We decide to take part in things when we have more to gain than we have to lose. It's a very mean way to live one's life, and we do, often. But in this world, it's a totally different ballgame. It's not that we have to sacrifice ourselves. Then we're still playing the old game of the benefit, who the benefit is for. Rather, We're moved to fall in love with, to be kind to, everything, including ourselves, especially ourselves, as well as others. So he says, we are hoping, waiting, and expecting to understand things as they are. That hoping, waiting, and expecting contains a quality of bewilderment. It contains confusion. And quite possibly, it also contains a quality of blankness and uncertainty. This is one of the ways that one can step into Shinyata, into the emptiness. It's in that moment of confusion, blankness, uncertainty. The world is just here. He says, actually, Shinyata experience takes place in very simple moments of life. At the point when our expectations are fading out and future possibilities have not yet turned up, there is a faint little gap in which there is the possibility of some unknown factor taking place, which is reality. It's the gap in our expectations, the gap in our constant mental manipulations. It is not all that profound to experience Shinyata. Throughout our life, there are possibilities of encountering gaps in our expectations. It can be shocking. It can be absolutely ordinary. Shinyata is what it is, and it's really what we bring to it, coming out of our confusion, that makes it glorious, that makes it commonplace. He says something beyond hope and fear is possible. Emptiness, Shinyata, beyond, that's what it means, beyond hope and fear, is taking place all the time. He says, sometimes we don't know what to do. We get so confused, we come to a stop. And this is not necessarily stupidity or ignorance. It could be that we have run out of new games, new gimmicks, and new concepts to fill the gap. We may have run out of ammo, so to speak. The ammo of confusion, the ammo of ego. Usually we are very resourceful in finding things to fill the gap, but sometimes we run out, and that happens more and more as we practice. It's so important to have a regular practice, to do it regularly, even if it's short, because what you are doing is you're beginning to custom yourself and develop the habit of coming back out of dream into reality. This not finding new possibilities, new ammo, not finding new tactics, not finding new techniques, not finding new plans, is Shinyata. With Shinyata, it is not possible to come up with anything. So, it's going to go beyond Shinyata. Shinyata is really the elimination of the errors, the two fundamental errors of confusion, and how the world begins to look in the absence of those errors, void of belief in I and other. Amazing idea, don't you think? That we could actually function as human beings effectively without believing in I and other. It would be a different kind of functioning, a different kind of life. It's the life of freedom, freedom from fear and fear for self, and it's a life of compassion, love for this life and love for this world. And the further we go on the path, the more it begins to appear, call to us. We begin to experience it in moments, maybe more than moments, Each of us is different. So I'll stop here, and we could have a discussion for a bit. We still have good time. I'm going to put this into gallery view. And if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, raise your hand, either your literal hand, or you could raise the hand. You can go down into where it says reactions, and you'll find a hand there that you can raise right at the bottom. You find the reaction.
Tony has his hand raised.
Good. Mr. Bright.
Mr. Baker, what do we do with evil, John? I mean, there's evil, there's in the world, there's so much negativity and actions of evil. I mean, how do we process that in terms of the work that we're doing on this path?
Let's talk about two different ways of approaching evil. I'm going to hyperbolize them, sort of make them bigger. One is that we react violently to it. We have our philosophy of goodness, and this evil activity violates our standards of good, and we become indignant. How could that person be blah, blah, blah? The other one is that we react effectively to protect as much as we can the people involved from harm, to correct the situation if we can, to be generous, to be kind, to pacify the situation. Then we begin to become Buddhas. It takes a Buddha to really pacify evil. And they say of a Buddha, that there are the four karmas, the four styles of activity with which an enlightened person, an awakened person, pacifies evil, deals with confusion and suffering in the world. The first is that they pacify it through understanding. If that doesn't work, they pacify it by being generous through generosity. If that doesn't work, they pacify it through magnetizing, seducing. And if that doesn't work, the last resort is destruction. All done egolessly, all done as a response to bring the situation into an enlightened state, you might say, a sane state.
Thank you. That's helpful.
It is, but in order for us to do this, we have to begin to move into this sane state. In order for us to be truly of help, we have to begin to discover emptiness, Shinyata, through our practice and our study. We have to begin to open our hearts to the world through the Bodhisattva Vow and by practicing compassion. And we begin to step into that place of being a Buddha, which sounds very glorious and grandiose, but really, as Trungpa Rinpoche said in other places, what we're doing is we're reclaiming our humanity.
He mentioned also at one point that it's about having good manners. And that I really responded to that statement.
That's great.
To have good manners, to help others, to help themselves.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We get so polarized. Speaking for myself, recently, a person in my orbit I discovered is a rabid anti-vaxxer. Believes that The vaccine is the tool of the billionaires in this country who are feeding off the pharmaceutical industry, and that COVID has been created as part of a plot to create this situation where people can get rich and the population can be thinned. And this person is very, very eloquent in describing this. I had a huge reaction. I was just furious, I mean, not furious, but I was repulsed. I was offended. That's not the reaction of a Buddha. That's the reaction of a person who is believing in systems whose, in right beliefs. Another belief in the vaccine.
I know someone that has similar attitudes who's just spent 3 weeks in hospital and has just been saved by contemporary medicine from dying from COVID.
Wow.
Yeah, well, we could go into it. It's just that we get hardened into our conceptual systems and we become rabid about it, And it's so easy to slip into that because we're convinced of our righteousness, our rightness, our correctness, speaking for myself. And really, what the path is about is beginning to see that, identify it, and let it go and deal with the situation sanely, rather than becoming polarized into camps, armies of right and wrong.
I was just going to add that just as in terms of our own meditation practice, in daily life, we find ourselves sometimes just coming back and waking up, that can happen in moments like that when we find ourselves really triggered, and perhaps we can, because of that moment of gap, that moment of openness, that moment of letting go, actually can perhaps relate to a situation in a more skillful or compassionate way. There are a lot of little remedies, you could say, in the Mahayana, even just contemplating the four immeasurables, and just thinking for a moment, even when we're really triggered, may all beings enjoy happiness and the root of happiness, may they be free. Something like that can just bring about a different attitude toward the situation, let alone, more, for instance, Shantideva, who wrote the Way of the Bodhisattva, talks about why we shouldn't respond to anger with anger, and to see that other people's anger comes from causes and conditions, some of which often of which we're not aware of. And that he points out that, beings try to harm themselves and kill themselves, and expecting beings to treat us better is, I found that really helpful in terms of the work that I did with, really emotionally disturbed kids. Why would I expect them to treat me better than they treat themselves? So that I could let go of my aggression and just, be more compassionate. And it's those little gaps in our speed and our habitual thinking that allow us to do things like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alejandro. Lodro, excuse me.
So earlier I heard the description about the 5 skandhas and how they compose ego. And I was wondering about the 5th skandha, consciousness. Is consciousness and awareness the same thing?
Consciousness in the 5th skandha is the ultimate consummation, you might say, of the development of ego. In the 1st skandha, I arises, you might say, or it depends on how you look at it. Sometimes it's other that triggers the whole thing. But in the 2nd skandha, the other side of the pole shows up. So if it was other in the 1st skandha, then I in the 2nd, and wants to know what the relationship is between I and other. Is it for me, against me, or neutral, the 3 poisons? And then in the 3rd skandha, having made a determination of that thing out there, that it's for me, let's say, then in the 3rd skandha, you want to pull it to you. This is called impulse. In the fourth skandha, you develop a story about it, why you want to pull it to you. You know, I love him or her because I like the color of their eyes, whatever it might be. The story, you know, I like that food because it tastes so yummy and salty, who knows what. And you develop a story. And in the fifth skandha, the consciousness, vijnana, the storyline of the fourth and the energy, the push-pull of the third mix, and you get the full-blown emotions, jealousy, hatred. Hatred is the story of why that person harmed me and why I'm angry with them. And then the feeling that informs it is wanting to destroy them, push them away, you know, get them out of your world. In the fifth skandha, it's the full-blown confusion of the emotions, all of it arising out of the fundamental error in the first of what happened. Ray Trungpa Rinpoche described it. This is interesting in terms of our discussion of Shinyata. The way he described the first skandha, he said, in one instance, he said, suddenly you're floating in the midst of just space with all kinds of phenomena happening. It's just this world, this is the world of Shinyata. But suddenly something emerges as a figure, and everything else becomes ground. When that is the birth of ignorance, that's the birth of the other, of the existence of other. So suddenly there's figure and ground, and that figure, everything else recedes into the ground, which is unimportant. The figure is important. Just like when you see a picture and you identify the figure, and the ground is of relatively less importance. As soon as that happens, that implies that there is a perceiver of that figure. That's me. That's the second skandha. Now you've got I and other. If that's there, I, the perceiver, am here. And then what's the relationship between them? Is it positive, neutral, or negative? What's the relationship between these two things? Are they going to come closer together, get further apart, or just stay the same distance? And you're into the third skandha and the fourth and the fifth, and it just keeps growing into confusion. Shinyata is coming back to that open space before there's a figure and a ground, before there's I and other.
So that would be basically the difference between pure awareness and the fifth skandha is awareness of, where there is now the duality.
Fifth skandha, there's tremendous duality and confusion and emotions. That's where the six realms live. The God realm, the human realm, the jealous God realm, the hell realm, all of that. They live in the fifth skandha. They're fully developed there. Full-blown samsaric confusion and suffering.
Awareness in the fifth skandha is really fixated, you could say. There is
I like that.
But it's confused or fixated.
I like that description. When I heard how the five skandhas are impermanent, and then I began to think, wait a second, but awareness, how is awareness, pure awareness, impermanent? And now actually awareness of something, then that would be conditioned. And that would be the element of impermanence behind it. At least that's how I'm understanding it right now. So
that's good.
Yeah.
That was thank you.
Dan has his hand
Oh,
raised.
good. Mr. Epstein.
Thank you. Thanks, both of you. You made this even more digestible than than Trungpa Rinpoche made it. Just, you know, it's Michael, thank you so much. That was a really great job. And you brought up something from the readings where you referred to the attituder. And when I was reading it, I forgot about it till you brought it up. It seems like a really important point. You know, he's adding ER to a word that usually doesn't have an ER, as opposed to the thinker, right? He makes attitude an attituder. So you could do that with a lot of other words. You could do the emotioner, the fixator like he does later, you know. And it's a really, to me, it seems like a really profound point. And again, thanks for bringing it up, in that we're not cutting through the attitudes, we're not cutting through the thoughts, we're not cutting through the feelings, we're not cutting through any of the objects of our perceptions, we're cutting through our thinking mind, right? The one who does the attituding, the one who does the emotioning, the one who does the, imagining, whatever. And it's, I think that's just really relevant to the whole, non-dualistic view that Shunyata is getting at.
Yeah, as long as there's an attitude,
Right.
there's already some duality, yes.
Right. And the object, instead of us being, thinking, we move from observing our thoughts as our becoming aware of the awareness. We move from that and we shift to who is doing the awarer, right? And that, and kind of refocus on
I
that.
think when we really let go, there's just observing.
Mm-hmm.
We're just being, you could say.
Right.
And so that we let go of the
Right.
subtle sense of observer, you could say.
Right. But we're observing the observer as opposed to just what is observed. And that's it's a difficult leap, I think.
Well, it is, because you can't really find an observer. It's just observing.
Right.
You can
Right.
look, and it ends up like endless reflections in mirrors. If you hold two mirrors together, they sort of go into infinity. And at some point, you just have to let go into just the observing.
Right.
Just the being.
Right. And there's no differentiation between the observed and the observer.
No. And that's why there was a reference to it in this chapter, or maybe Michael made it, that the space we inhabit and cognition are the same. They're one. It's not like there is a knower and a known. Everything is self-known. Phenomena are just part of the space. They're constant modulations, like this hand moving across the computer screen, like these words appearing and disappearing. And all of it is lit. The Yogacharans made a big contribution when they talked about self-luminous cognition, that everything that arises is lit with cognition. There is no knower and known. It's all self-luminously revealed. That's another version of Shunyata. We don't have to go into later, people argued about it, but it was maintained, that idea of self-luminous cognition, in the Tantras. I see Randy and Kim had their hands up, and then we'll go to Philip. No? You passed? Okay. Philip.
Thank you both. That was terrific. I think getting back to what Dan was just saying, what you both were just saying, another way of saying that thing is that, and maybe the word poisons isn't the best word, it's not anger that's the problem, it's our reaction to the anger that's the problem. That anger is just anger.
Okay. Oh. You want to say more?
Well, I think that's something that we grow beyond, and that we come to realize that passion, aggression, indifference, they're taught at this level as the kleshas, as the three poisons, but that's just like ego pasted on top of something.
Yeah, we're getting even further along in the teachings with this idea that you've got, Philip. You're leaping ahead, because in enlightened mind, or in the mind of Shinyata even, you're right. The emotions, which at a lower level are defilements and problematic, become positives. They're called in the teachings wisdoms, but we're jumping way ahead with that idea. Do you want to say anything, Michael?
I was thinking along the same lines. That's really comes to the fore in the Vajrayana, where the realization of Vajrayana is seeing the wisdom in everything, in all experience, you could say, the sacredness of all experience. And I think it comes back again to, you're right, anger by itself is just energy. But when it's tied into fixation on ego and fixation on ego of other, then it then it is poisonous. It is quite destructive. And, so it's how we relate to it. It's that way with really any thought we have, it's not the thought itself, it's how we relate to it that, either creates a problem or creates sanity. Or maybe that create isn't the right word. Is neurosis or is sanity?
Meg.
I think this sort of relates to something I was wondering about. Michael, you said that Shinyata is how things actually are.
Yep.
And I wondered, it makes me feel like there's an absolute. So I wondered in the realm of emptiness if there is an absolute, or if it's all still relative.
That's a really interesting question, actually, and it goes into the difference and some of the meaning of absolute and relative truth. But I will say this: I think I was going to say that the thing with Shinyata is it's sort of like the opening lines of the Tao Te Ching, that the Shinyata that can be told is not the true Shinyata, and so that you could say that there's something absolute, but it's also empty at the same time. So that exactly what does absolute mean? There's whole schools of Mahayana philosophy, and some of them are incredibly, really interesting to study, and some are maddening in the level of analysis and detail they go into. But I think the most important thing is that's why I actually kind of like in some ways the use of boundlessness in the Zen tradition to talk about Shinyata, because I think that really gets at the openness, the possibility, and the sense of possibility and freedom that comes from being aware of egolessness or being free of fixation. So I don't know if any of that helps, but there's absolute, but it's not anything you can hold on to. But it's absolute in the sense of, yes, that is how things actually are, that things don't have a permanent fixed identity, that things are in constant flux, that things are always changing. I really liked another line in the, if I can find it very quickly.
It sounds like what you're saying is that it's like a Zen koan.
Well, yes, it is. It's in some sense ungraspable because it's always in the moment. It's always in the moment.
We're going to be dealing with this a lot as we go along. The difference between the two truths, they're called absolute and relative.
Yeah, I didn't want to start going to all of that, but I like this.
And a simple definition is that absolute truth is your experience as it arises in the present moment. The relative truth are the labels that we affix to that experience. And they're relative because they're not really, they're just concepts. It's like you have an experience of the table in front of you. That's absolute, the experience. The word table, and that I like this table, those are relative terms. And this is what dominates the teachings. Then later on, there will be two levels of relative truth, the accurate and the inaccurate. And they say the false and the true relative truth. I mean, table is relatively true, but I mean, in any event, there's this fundamental distinction that's made between what we experience and the words that we attach to it, which are the relative truth. The relative truth is usefully true in particular time and place, and for a particular purpose and for particular people.
Thank you.
I found the line I wanted to read. It's at the point where our expectations are fading out and future possibilities have not yet turned up, there is a faint little gap in which there is the possibility of some unknown factor taking place. So it's that on the spot experience right in the present. And, you know, a lot of times we think we know what's happening next. We think we're in control and we can control things, but that's a myth. It's, you know, the reality is that, you know, the situation is always open.
Great question. Thank you. Anyone? Let's see, oh, we're over time. Okay, lets us off the hook. So let's close with the dedication of merit, hoping that people will come to the discussion group tomorrow and we'll have a good time, as we always do. You're invited. And let's see, who is doing, Meg, are you going to lead us in this chat?
Sure.
Can you turn off the heater?
Oh, I can't, you know. It'll take 3 minutes to turn off, so maybe Sarah should close.
Okay, I can do that. I'm sorry. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
You all.
Thank you.
Have a beautiful night.
I just
Have a
couldn't
good
hear
night.
you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Good night.
Night. Night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
No.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Robert.
Good night.